January, which is great because it's like the weather's perfect, no bugs. So it's and you miss some cold weather here. So it's nice. It's nice. Yeah.
Good morning. Grace to you and peace in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, and welcome to our Spunt lectures. My name is Clay McCauley, and I have the privilege of serving as alumni director for the seminary. Here is the mission for Union Presbyterian Seminary, which you will be hearing throughout today and tomorrow. Union Presbyterian Seminary prepares people to be leaders of gospel-inspired, transformative change in pursuit of a more just and compassionate world. We welcome you to these lectures, and you are invited to join us for all of the activities planned for today, many of which are shown on a schedule that you may have received at registration. There's a wide range of activities, reunions, and gatherings held throughout the day, and a schedule for these 3 days is available to you. Some of you have asked if the lectures and worship will be available online, and they will be through our website. And there is some printed information that we've had available at registration and should have for you throughout today, should you wish to see what those links are. This morning, we will gather back here in Watts Chapel for worship at 11 o'clock. The Reverend Dr. Craig Barnes is our preacher, and his sermon from Acts 15 and 16 is entitled, Just Keep Moving. Our alumni luncheon occurs today at 12:30. We will gather between 12:15 and 12:30 in the Holderness Dining Room in Richmond Hall. The Reverend Lori Rabel, pastor head of staff of Selwyn Avenue Presbyterian Church, Charlotte, and a secretary of the Board of Trustees, and a 2006 graduate of UP-SIM Charlotte, is our keynote speaker. If you did not register for the luncheon, some limited seating is available for non-eating participants. I also wanted to let you know that complimentary copies of recent issues of Interpretation, a journal of Bible and theology, are available for you. Interpretation, committed to the interpretation of the Bible and the Church for the world. These copies will be available in Watts Hall and the foyer behind me, and also in the Holderness Dining Room. The latest issue is on Psalms, and the next one will be on Bible and film. If you're not already a subscriber and want to subscribe to the journal, you'll find information in the journal or scan the QR code when you pick up the journal. So please find your way. There'll be a light reception following this lecture in the lobby, and please help yourself. To assist in transportation on campus today and tomorrow, the seminary staff will gladly offer a lift in the golf cart, and it will be available just outside of Watts Hall. Now it's my pleasure to call on Dr. Sam Adams, the Mary Jane and John F. McNair Chair of Biblical Studies, to offer his welcome and to host this morning's lecture. Sam?
Thanks, Clay. As you look at the issues of the journal in the lobby, you'll note the number of stalwart alums of UP-SIM featured in the pages of the journal. And if you need help, I can give you the QR code to subscribe. We're really delighted here today, this morning, for our second Spunt lecture. John is one of the leading scholars in theology, and especially in the topic of interreligious conversations, and so it's a real treat to have him here on campus. And he's also get a chance to chat with him because he's one of the nicest and most approachable speakers that we've had. So anyway, our first opening hymn is number 66, Every Time I Feel the Spirit, Please Rise, in body or in spirit. In that same spirit, let's have a word of prayer. Eternal God, we are grateful this morning for the gift of life and the wondrous signs of your creation all around us, for the rain that sustains everything you have created and the beauty of springtime. We stand in awe. Be with us today as we reflect on important matters, especially how we relate to each other. We give thanks for John and his insights and ask that you might open our hearts and minds to his lecture this morning. Give us the discernment to think about how we relate to persons of all faiths and backgrounds during these turbulent and uncertain days. Merciful God, strengthen us in prayer that we may lift up the brokenness of the world for your healing and share in your abundant love. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. John, welcome.
You know, with a prayer like that, the genre of this might change from lecture to sermon. And we'd have Sam and the Holy Spirit to blame for that. I must say at the outset that I am both encouraged and discouraged by your response to my lecture yesterday. I'm encouraged because you found it timely. I'm discouraged because you found it timely. So there it is. Let's begin. So last night I offered a diagnosis of our post-truth predicament, but I also refused a presentist temptation to suggest that the problem is wholly new. Instead, I maintained that post-truth is a perennial problem in a novel configuration. As evidence for that contention, I showed that Mohandas Gandhi and George Orwell had already identified at the beginning and middle of the last century several features of what we have come to call the post-truth predicament. This morning, let me begin by adding the brilliant Jewish German-American philosopher Hannah Arendt's voice to the mix. What follows is probably the most famously cited, most often cited selection from her entire corpus. Again, I'll be quoting her at some length, and you'll see why in just a moment. So here's Hannah Arendt. A mixture of gullibility and cynicism had been an outstanding characteristic of mob mentality before it became an everyday phenomenon of the masses. In an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses had reached the point where they would, at the same time, believe everything and nothing, think that everything was possible and that nothing was true. The mixture in itself was remarkable enough because it spelled the end of the illusion that gullibility was a weakness of unsuspecting primitive souls, and cynicism the vice of superior and refined minds. Mass propaganda discovered that its audience was ready at all times to believe the worst, no matter how absurd, and did not particularly object to being deceived because it held that every statement was a lie anyhow. The totalitarian mass leaders based their propaganda on the correct psychological assumption that under such conditions, one could make people believe the most fantastic statements one day and trust that if the next day they were given irrefutable proof of their falsehood, they would take refuge in cynicism. Instead of deserting the leaders who had lied to them, they would protest that they had known all along that the statement was a lie and would admire the leaders for their superior tactical cleverness. Close quote. Sound familiar at all? This passage from Arendt's 1948 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, I'm sure you'd agree, feels like it could have been taken from this morning's newspaper. This should be for us no source of comfort, but it does also signal that we should not be entirely at sea. There are clearly resources that we can examine to begin to get bearings in a difficult and disorienting time. Arendt adds to the conversation a wisdom about the conditions under which truth might be discerned. We might call these dispositional conditions. If I'm disposed either to be gullible or cynical, or as Arendt points out, both at the same time, then I am no longer in a position to discern the truth of any matter. My capacity for discernment has been damaged. Propagandists know this to be true and create the conditions under which masses will simultaneously believe everything and nothing. Why? Why work to create such conditions? Yale historian Timothy Snyder, who has studied Arendt, puts the matter with alarming precision. Post-truth is pre-fascism. Undermine the conditions under which we can discover the truth. Flood the information pool with falsities. Induce a feeling of vertigo among populations who no longer know what to believe. Then insist the truth is what dear leader or big brother says it is. His word and only his word is reliable. Post-truth is pre-fascism indeed. But the addition of Arendt, as well as Orwell and Gandhi to this tale, only serves to further cement what should be, by now, relatively obvious. The content of post-truth may well be new. Climate denialism, election denialism, anti-vaxxerism, QAnon, and other forms of conspiracism. But the problem as such is not new. What is, though, genuinely new is also the scale of the problem. The capacity to disseminate enormous quantities of information, or in our time, misinformation and disinformation, is unprecedented. The contemporary post-truth predicament is considerably amplified by new media technologies. We need not offer an extended analysis of the further complication of silos. Right? Each of us conspires in a process of finally tailoring just exactly the media sources that are shown to us on the basis of what we tell the media we want to see. Gandhi worried about newspapers, Orwell about newspapers and radio, and we rightly worry about social media and more recently AI. The human incapacity to discern the true from the false has always been with us. But the capacities of new media to inundate us with falsehoods, that is truly unprecedented. So the work of critical discernment will require us to distinguish between the new problem of scale and the perennial problem of not being able or even interested in telling the difference between the true and the false. As for the perennial false, might we listen to the words of Jesus himself? Recall that when he is asked by his disciples why he speaks in parables, Matthew's Jesus responds, "The reason I speak to them in parables is that seeing they do not perceive, and hearing they do not listen, nor do they understand. With them indeed is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah that says, 'You will indeed listen but never understand, and you will indeed look but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and their ears are hard of hearing, and they have shut their eyes, so that they might not look with their eyes, and hear with the ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them.'" We shall have occasion to return to these verses at the conclusion of this lecture. But at this juncture, I wish only to argue that clearly Jesus is already diagnosing the post-truth problem. And yes, I know I'm trafficking in a deliberate anachronism, but please note what Jesus is saying when he speaks of those who look but do not perceive, those who listen without understanding. Is that not a compelling and indeed profound description of the problems before us? Can there be a keener way of describing the 40% of the American population who believe that Trump won the last election, when the facts of the matter are plainly available? Surely this too is a case of those who look but do not perceive. Clearly then, the post-truth problem cannot be new if Jesus already has it in view. And if you think Jesus already recognized that there were many who seem incapable of seeing what is right before them, remember, he's quoting Isaiah. I will resist mightily the temptation to say more about both of these passages now, as that would give away the rest of this lecture. For now, I want only to signal that we have very good reason, I hope by now conclusive reason. Scholars have to belabor arguments sometimes. That we have very good reason to suggest that the incapacity to see what is true, even self-evidently true, is not novel. And if the problem is not novel, its causes and cures cannot be wholly novel either. Use that as a clue. If anyone tells you that the problem is new and its causes are new, you should be suspicious. So, as we turn to the question of trying to understand the root causes and cures for the post-truth problem, We ought to be very suspicious if someone blames, say, for example, postmodern university professors as the source of the problem, as though postmodernism was the problem. How could that be? I mean, Jacques Derrida did not exist when Jesus was speaking. Perhaps he anticipated it. So, perennial problems simply cannot have novel causes or cures. Now, let's dive into the work for this lecture. As my lecture yesterday and what I have thus far argued this morning has shown, the reality that we are indeed confronting a post-truth problem is now well understood. There is now a veritable cottage industry that describes and analyzes our current predicament. While there's much to be gained from reading this literature, the diagnoses on offer are shallow. And what is worse still are the superficiality of the etiologies on offer. To offer an accurate etiology will be the work of this morning's lecture. Now, I have already used that term a few times without offering a definition. There are pharmacists in the room who know what an etiology is, but I know that it's not a term of regular day-to-day conversation. So again, here's how Oxford Languages Dictionary defines the term. Medicine, the cause, set of causes, or manner of causation of a disease or condition. Or the causation of diseases and disorders as a subject of investigation. My argument in this lecture will depart from prevalent etiologies now on offer. Without giving away all that I have to say, I will insist that the reigning etiologies, the reigning causal accounts for what is going on, might even serve to exacerbate the post-truth problem rather than resolve it. Here's partly what I mean. Doctors can rightly diagnose a disease. You have pneumonia. But then misidentify the pathogen at work and in the process prescribe a treatment that will only exacerbate the condition. Prescribe the wrong antibiotic and things can go from bad to worse. So right diagnosis is a necessary but only a partial first step. There's no way to offer an accurate prognosis or cure without understanding the etiology for the disease. Misunderstand the etiology, prescribe the wrong cure, and you might well kill the patient. So, a whole assembly of solutions have been proposed to combat our current condition by those of us who choose to live among the reality-based community. These include greater attention to, and just listen to some of these proposed solutions, greater attention to information literacy, a call for a return to common sense, a greater emphasis on critical reasoning skills, teaching the scientific process, not just the scientific conclusions, numeracy, data literacy, and legislation that restrains social media giants from spreading false information. One way to summarize these disparate efforts thematically is this. We must return to Enlightenment values. We must return to Enlightenment values. Those who sound this theme are convinced that we are in the post-truth predicament because we have fallen away from the Enlightenment's commitment to sober reason. Instead of a commitment to reason, we have fallen prey to emotion-laden flights of fancy, or we have denied that truth is anything other than a configuration of power. On this latter front, the post-truth problem is the fault of Derrida-loving and Foucault-loving university and presumably also seminary professors. Maybe you, Sam? I'm looking at you, Sam. To combat these postmodern impulses, reason and reason alone will be our salvation. Perhaps you can see why I've already referred to Jesus and Isaiah. If it's possible that our Lord was already onto the post-truth problem, it's quite unlikely that we can blame poor Jacques or Michel for our undoing. To begin to get a sense of what contemporary etiologies are on offer, let us return briefly to the dictionary definition that put the post-truth phenomenon on the map. Let me reread that definition, but now with a closer eye to what the definition itself suggests about the root causes at work in the post-truth phenomenon. Here's that definition again. Quote, relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Close quote. I want to suggest that the dictionary definition offers not just a neutral diagnosis of the post-truth condition, it also contains a fairly explicit etiology. The post-truth condition, our incapacity to tell fact from fiction, is caused by our reliance on appeals to emotion. Emotion, or appeals to emotion, that's the root problem. Truth-seeking on this account must therefore be a strictly fact-seeking endeavor. Like some old-fashioned detective from black and white TV days talking to eyewitnesses who get carried away, we, the dispassionate investigators, must narrate the old mantra, just the facts, ma'am. Think for a moment about all that lies buried or implicit in the definition. Facts matter, feelings don't. Feelings are the problem, hence reason is the solution. Given these dichotomies, we simply cannot imagine speaking about true feelings as opposed to false feelings. Any such locution is a sign of cognitive confusion. They are nonsensical assertions, as feelings and facts have nothing whatsoever to do with each other. Dear listeners, these assumptions are so ingrained in our minds and hearts that they not only go uncontested, we cannot even imagine how we might go about contesting them. We neither have the language nor the categories to contest the thinking versus feeling binary, and hence the idea that thinking is really just a matter of gathering isolated factoids. To see how these core ideas, found at the very heart of the definition of post-truth, find expression in relevant literature, let's just take a few moments to examine some of the most prominent figures who have offered their analyses and etiologies of the post-truth moment. I want to begin with Daniel Levitin. Levitin is a Canadian-American psychologist, neuroscientist, and musician. He's a lucid and charismatic speaker and writer. In his aptly titled book, the title itself tells you much, A Field Guide to Lies, Critical Thinking with Statistics and the Scientific Method, he writes, and I quote, "The best defense against sly prevaricators, the most reliable one, is for every one of us to learn how to become critical thinkers. We are a social species, and we tend to believe what others tell us, and our brains are great at storytelling and confabulation machines. Given an outlandish premise, we can usually generate fanciful explanations for how it might be so. But that's the difference between creative thinking and critical thinking. Note the opposition. Between lies and the truth. The truth has factual, objective evidence to support it. Some claims might be true, but truthful claims are true." Now, some of you might be wondering, now, John can't possibly critique that claim, can he? What could possibly be wrong with a stout and robust defense of critical thinking? Isn't that what educational institutions do? As it happens, I really have nothing against his defense of critical thinking. We'd all be better off for learning what Levitin has to teach us. My concern is rather about what his proposed solution to the post-truth problem tells us about what he thinks the problem is and what its causes are. He tells us that we are in a post-truth situation because we have more access to information than the human species has ever had at its disposal. Unfortunately, not only do we have more information than ever, we also have more misinformation and disinformation than ever. That means that some are misinforming us and others are actively lying to us. As he puts it, the incompetents and liars are at work. The critical question is, why are we at their mercy? Why is it that we are so easily taken in and duped? That is the question that yields for us Levitin's etiology. He believes we lack the cognitive tools to sort truth from falsehood, fact from fiction. So, Levitin's noteworthy book includes sections on teaching numeracy, how to smoke out the ways in which people use data and charts and graphs to falsely mislead persons. Sections on establishing reliable expertise. When can you decide someone really is an expert in what he or she claims to be? An account of how the scientific process actually works. A section on logical fallacies and the like. Get the picture? The cure is critical thinking, which corrects for the deficit in our capacity for rationally distinguishing the true from the false. Levitin's understanding of the etiology of the post-truth condition is therefore clear. A flooded and polluted information commons and consumers who lack the rational skills to tell fact from fiction. So that's the root cause, the lack of those rational skills. The cure, therefore, is providing us with the skills needed to think clearly and well, so that we are neither misled nor deceived. If the problem and its causes are deficits in rational capacities, then the cure, too, must be rational in nature. Clear? How convincing is Levitin's etiology and proposed solution? I'm afraid that Levitin simply ignores an almost self-evident feature of our post-truth condition. When presented with clear and convincing rational information, people often remain stubbornly attached to their manifestly false positions. We're not here speaking of always or even often about complicated questions about philosophy, wherein deciding what's true and what's false is demanding or even impossible. On the contrary, when we speak about post-truth, we are routinely speaking of matters such as election denial. Consider the likely apocryphal statement from a flat earther who is reported as having said, "Our numbers are growing all across the globe." That's a good one, isn't it? Why do so many people believe in manifest falsehoods? Why are we so resistant to truth? Will training people in logical thinking resolve our post-truth predicament? Something else seems to be in operation rather than a mere deficiency in our rational capacities. Levitin is a very smart man. Indeed, he seems more than dimly aware that other deeper forces might be at work. Recall what he says right after he asserts why we must all learn how to become critical thinkers. Quote, "We are a social species, and we tend to believe what others tell us, and our brains are great storytelling and confabulation machines. Given an outlandish premise, we can usually generate fanciful explanations for how it might be so." You see, there's more than a hint here that there are other factors at play, factors that might not be addressed by teaching us how to read charts and graphs with greater sophistication. Why are our brains such fantastic storytelling and confabulation machines? Is this a bug in human anthropology, or might it be a feature? Why do we tend to believe what others tell us? Is the cure to that a rigorous rational skepticism? To questions such as these, we will return shortly. Let me turn to one more figure in the analysis of the post-truth literature, one whom we already encountered last night, the philosopher Lee McIntyre. As befits a thinker who grows and changes across his many books, as his thinking matures, MacIntyre's understanding of the post-truth predicament and how to address it continues to evolve. He also gives a richer account of a range of complicated phenomena, such as motivated reasoning, confirmation bias, and other factors that lead people to remain stubbornly attached to mistaken convictions. His diagnosis is therefore far more sophisticated and nuanced. He also tells rich historical narratives about how we got to where we are now. His historical accounts includes a very far-reaching understanding of the roots of the post-truth phenomena in the work of tobacco companies, who worked hard to subvert scientific work that was quickly coming around to concluding that smoking causes cancer. Knowing it was game over if those scientific results were not put into question, MacIntyre shows how tobacco companies worked to introduce uncertainty into and cast doubt on the science in question. He shows how that particular case of science denial offered the blueprint and template for how to sow doubt about other kinds of research, including, of course, for the case for climate denial. Time does not permit us to delve into his compelling and convincing historical analyses. I think they're on the money. The most suggestive and, to my mind, compelling feature of his work, though, is his recognition that we are driven to believe what we want to believe. Here is MacIntyre in his own words, quote, "If we are already motivated to want to believe certain things, it doesn't take much to tip us over into believing them, especially if others we care about already do. Our inherent cognitive biases make us ripe for manipulation and exploitation by those who have an agenda to push, especially if they can discredit all other sources of information. Just as there is no escape from cognitive bias, a news silo is no defense against post-truth. For the danger is that at some level they are connected. We are all beholden to our sources of information, but we are especially vulnerable when they tell us exactly what we want to hear." Close quote. Now, MacIntyre rightly shows us why we so often believe what is false. We want to. But now, what's the solution to the problem? MacIntyre in his book, Post-Truth, doubles down on the same old, same old. We have yet another thinker who insists, just the facts, ma'am. Insist on telling the truth, he tells us. Repeat as necessary. Why? Because he believes that repeated encounter with facts that disconfirm what we want to believe really can change our minds. And he's got research to back him up. Of course he does, right? So here I quote him on some of that research. Redlosk and colleagues discovered experimental evidence that an affective tipping point does in fact exist, which suggests that voters are not immune to disconfirming information after all, even when initially acting as motivated reasoners. James Kuklinski and colleagues learned in another study that although misinformed beliefs can be quite stubborn, it is possible to change partisans' minds when one hits them between the eyes over and over with factually correct information. It may not be easy to convince people with inconvenient facts, but it is apparently possible. Close quote. And as I said, MacIntyre has research, empirical research, to back up his conviction that it is possible to change people's mind by repeatedly presenting them with the right information. We must see to it that it hits them between the eyes. The violence of this metaphor is worth noting. Perhaps you noticed. As the goal seems to be to batter motivated reasoners into giving their assent. Now, to be fair, in later work, MacIntyre does well to name how vital it is to do the long and hard work of relationship and trust building. He rightly shows us that that kind of relational work is indispensable to the work of bringing people around. Now, I do not doubt the research that MacIntyre presents. He is surely right to insist on the power of the repetition effect. If serial liars know that essential to the lie is the power it gains by repetition, it follows that repeating the truth also has power. The power to break through entrenched attachment to falsity. But is there not here a curious mismatch between the etiology, we hold manifestly false positions because of our cognitive biases and our attachment to them, and the cure? The cure seems unequal to and out of keeping with the etiology. Those who are at work on resolving the post-truth predicament keep proposing to solve a problem of desire with the remedy of information. A problem of desire with the remedy of information. Again and again, we have thinkers who insist that rationality, science, and true information are the proper countering mechanism to our post-truth predicament. Now, while I do not doubt that it is important to cultivate social media literacy, scientific literacy, information literacy, and data literacy, commended by the defenders of critical reason, none go to the root of the problem. Why? My proposed diagnosis is so simple as to seem simplistic. I have decided, by the way, that I'm going to make a career of stating the obvious. I am more than a little afraid that after you hear what I say, you will have significant reservations about having selected me as your Spunt lecturer. And if you do come to that negative judgment, you can blame President Blunt and the faculty who issued the invitation. Okay, get ready for rocket science. I hold that the problem of post-truth is a problem of desire. We do not know the truth because we do not want to know it. See how smart I am? My understanding of the etiology of the post-truth predicament in no small measure echoes part of what MacIntyre proposes. But as you will shortly see, the differences between our accounts are considerable. Those differences will also show themselves most clearly in my final lecture, because my prescribed course of treatment will differ quite considerably from his. When I think about the challenges of truth and post-truth, I am routinely drawn back to my favorite courtroom scene in any movie ever. I am talking about the cross-examination scene in A Few Good Men. I'm glad many of you have seen it. I realize that the reference is a bit dated now, but the acting and writing are just brilliant. In the movie, Tom Cruise plays a wet-behind-the-ears Navy JAG, Lieutenant Daniel Caffey, who is faced with the task of cross-examining the very senior, highly decorated, and fearsome Colonel Nathan Jessup, played by Jack Nicholson. In cross-examination, Cruise's character repeatedly demands the truth from Jack Nicholson, to which Nicholson memorably responds, "You can't handle the truth." That's pretty good, right? I can't do a good Obama, but a pretty passable Nicholson. That charged courtroom encounter intimates something that routinely passes unrecognized. Truth can be painful. Truth can challenge our pre-existent values and commitments. Truth can overturn our deepest convictions about the way things are. Truth can be powerfully disruptive. My further claim is that we can't handle the truth because we do not want it. The core problem with our present inability to secure agreement about what is the case, what is true, is not at heart a problem of the mind, narrowly construed, and hence a problem of epistemology as it's usually understood. Rather, the problem is just the heart. Or, even more accurately stated, the problem is the very bifurcation of mind and heart. A bifurcation we absolutely take for granted and count for us as a matter of common sense. The notion that knowing is a work of the mind and desiring a work of the heart splits the two from each other and sets them at odds. Moreover, that bifurcation is itself rooted in another dichotomy we take for granted. Desire and the longings of the heart are affairs of the body, knowing the work of the mind. Hence, knowing is an independent affair which has little to do with affairs of the heart. All these are just assumptions. We're not necessarily explicitly maintaining them. On the contrary, though, I hold that to know the truth, we must tutor the heart, not merely inform the mind. Again, even this bifurcation is not quite on target, but let's at least begin by taking for granted the conventional dichotomy. On these terms, mind unanchored in a cultivated heart is easily carried off by the winds of popular opinion and buffeted about by gales of conspiracism. Overwhelmed by information overload, much of it unreliable, we have at our fingertips an unimaginable ocean of data, but have lost access to reality. The heart, adrift, is easily hijacked by those who can manipulate attention by stoking our fears or appealing to our cravings. Lacking the wisdom that comes from a cultivated heart, we drift worldless, without bearings, longing for orientation and belonging readily supplied by advertisers, hucksters, and conmen. The goods they offer are flashy, and upfront expenses are cheap. But the long-term disinformation, conspiracism, anti-maskerism, anti-vaxxerism, and climate denial is nothing less than species demise. Wisdom cries aloud, but few are prepared to hear her voice because few desire her. So, thus far, my account of what ails us and its causes might not appear to part company with McIntyre and others have to say. Here's where I do. If the post-truth problem is a problem of desire, then it will not do to treat a problem of distorted desire with a remedy of more information. Battering persons with information is an inadequate solution to the problem at hand. Put simply, if the desire to know the truth is overwhelmed by other desires, such as the desire to belong to an elect group that possesses occult information unavailable to the lamestream media, then what counts as true, what is recognized to be true, will be what accords with that particular desire. The recognition that there is an intimate connection between knowing and desiring, truth and feeling, is only beginning to dawn in scholarly circles. Feminist philosophers have led the way for some decades now, but as it goes in the academy, we're only starting to listen to them. The university, for all our talk about being postmodern, remains hidebound to a reductive opposition between knowing and desiring. Cultural and scholarly winds are now beginning to shift as respectful attention to the emotions as ways of knowing begins to gain ground. But discourses of objectivity still stoutly retain their hold, just as much on academic opinion as it does on popular imagination. In conventional secular modern discourses, a suspicion of desire is essential to objectivity. To know the truth, one must arrest subjective bias rooted in desiring. What remains unthought with some notable exceptions, is the following possibility: that desire might be an indispensable and even inseparable companion to truth-seeking. Imagine that. Misguided desire, desire in the form of confirmation bias, of believing what we want to believe, that is quite rightly recognized as a problem. But then the proposed solutions say nothing about what might be done to transform or tutor those desires. Why not? Why not prescribe the right medication when you've actually understood the right root causes? Well, because our conceptions about the nature of education remain resolutely targeted at training the mind, narrowly construed. The work of education is critical thinking, not critical feeling. Although, thankfully, some have begun to write about the latter. Within dominant educational frameworks, especially the most elite, distorted desire is left alone. There's no sense that desire might be transformed. Or to use the language of the Christian mystical tradition, there's no way of imagining that desire might undergo a purgation. On the contrary, a distorted desire is to be overcome by being presented with the facts of the matter. Hit them between the eyes. How do we come to see reason and desire not only as independent from each other, but even opposed? How do we come to believe that we can know the truth apart from a desire for the truth? From whence does this sense of opposition emerge in the West? My own understanding of why we are here derives from the work of the late Foucault. I know, I'm turning to the person who is regarded as the cause of the problem. I guess I might be one of those postmodern university professors after all. Although the uses to which I put his ideas are unlikely to be endorsed by Foucault, I believe that his own genealogical analysis offers a wealth of resources for understanding the etiology of our post-truth predicament. So this is a long quote, and it's a bit meatier than the other, so I'll try to read this slowly. I find this fascinating. We can say that we enter the modern age, I mean the history of truth enters its modern period, when it is assumed that what gives access to the truth, the condition for the subject's access to the truth, is knowledge, connaissance, and knowledge alone. It seems to me that what I have called the Cartesian moment takes on its position and meaning at this point, without in any way wanting to say it's a question of Descartes, that he was its inventor or that he was the first to do this. Now listen to this. I think the modern age of the history of truth begins when knowledge itself and knowledge alone gives access to the truth. That is to say, it is when the philosopher or the scientist or simply someone who seeks the truth can recognize the truth and have access to it in himself and solely through his activity of knowing, without anything else being demanded of him, and without him having to change or alter his being as subject. So, in English, Foucault holds that the modern moment in the history of truth arrives when we moderns come to believe that we can know the truth just by opening our eyes. Get up in the morning, kind of groggy, you open your eyes, the fog clears, boom, the truth is yours. Follow the right scientific procedures and the truth can be known. You need not become otherwise. You need not desire otherwise to know the truth. Nothing is at stake in the knower, the subject who knows. in the business of knowing. Truth is neutral with respect to the disposition, desire, or subjectivity of the one who knows. Proper procedure alone suffices. Prior to the modern moment, Foucault holds that the truth could not be known apart from undertaking some spiritual disciplines. Yes, these are his words, right? We regard him as the arch enemy of faith and of tradition. All curious ways of depicting Michel Foucault. So listen to this meaty quote, and it's fantastic. It's maybe my favorite quote in the entirety of his literature. We will call, quote, "We will call philosophy the form of thought that asks, what is it that enables the subject to have access to the truth, and which attempts to determine the conditions and limits of the subject's access to the truth. If we call this philosophy, then I think we would call spirituality the search, practice, and experience through which the subject carries out the necessary transformations on himself in order to have access to the truth. We will call spirituality, then, the set of these researches, practices, and experiences, which may be purifications, ascetic exercises, renunciations, conversions of looking, modifications of existence, etc., which are not for knowledge, but for the subject, for the subject's very being, the price to be paid for access to the truth. Isn't that great? The price to be paid for access to the truth. Foucault shows, as his great power, with meticulous care in that lecture and that book, that the entire philosophical history of the West, prior to what he calls the Cartesian moment, required that the philosopher must engage in care of the self. The Greek is epimelia hetu, care of the self. Here he stands in agreement with the work of his friend and inspiration in study of ancient philosophy, Pierre Hadot, on philosophy as a way of life. Philosophy as a way of life. Nowadays, a university philosopher is a philosopher is someone who writes philosophy books. They don't actually have to engage in any care of the self or any conversions in the way of looking, right? Likewise, the theologian is the one who writes academic books, whereas Evagrius offered, to my mind, one of the Desert Fathers, 4th century, offered what was the earliest, or one of the earliest accounts of who the theologian was. The theologian is the one who prays truly. The one who prays truly is the theologian, right? And so when people call me theologian, I'm like, by which definition? So, now this is back to Foucault, quote, "As the very word philosophia makes clear, classically speaking, there can be no bifurcation between desire." Oh, actually, this is me. As the very word philosophia makes clear, classically speaking, there can be no bifurcation between desire, phileia, and wisdom, sophia. Wisdom is granted only to those who desire her. The philosophical way of life requires and presupposes some account of spirituality, some work requiring, here I quote, purifications, ascetic exercises, renunciations, conversions of looking. It's possible to be postmodern and ancient at the same time. Right? Don't those sound like the stuff of our line of work? This work of spirituality, as he defines this, is fundamentally a matter of redirecting and transforming the desiring self. If no transformation, then no truth. If no transformation, then no truth. Again, a bit more Foucault. Quote, very roughly, we can say that this conversion may take place in the form of a movement that removes the subject from his current status and condition, either an ascending movement of the subject himself, or else a movement by which the truth comes to him and enlightens him. Again, quite conventionally, let us call this movement, in either of its directions, the movement of eros, love. Another major form through which the subject can and must transform himself in order to have access to the truth is a kind of work. This is a work of the self on the self, an elaboration of the self by the self, a progressive transformation of the self by the self for which one takes responsibility in a long labor of ascesis, from which we get the word ascetic. Eros and ascesis are, I think, the two major forms in Western spirituality for conceptualizing the modalities by which the subject must be transformed in order finally to become capable of the truth. This is the second characteristic of spirituality. Folks, you don't have to make up your own definition of spirituality, just go to Foucault. Now, I will leave it to Foucault scholars to tell me if the use to which I am putting him is one that Foucault would countenance. But I find his analysis of the modern moment, what he calls the Cartesian moment, profoundly revelatory. He insists that it is only in the Cartesian moment and its subsequent unfoldings that we have come to believe that truth can be had without price, without a radical transformation of the desiring subject. From then on, knowledge becomes a matter of proper procedure. Epistemology, the study of knowledge, is now severed from having any truck with the travails of desiring. Knowing and desiring are no longer in intimate relationship. They are either indifferent to each other or they are in outright opposition. If desire is indifferent to the work of knowing, it can be ignored or bypassed. If, on the other hand, desiring is figured as an opponent of knowledge, it must be severely sidelined or opposed. And such opposition cannot seek to tutor, transform, or heal desire. Desired, instead, must be battered into submission by the sheer force of truth, with truth here understood as mere facts or bits of isolated information. Foucault's account of the birth of the modern paradigm of truth, as opposed to every other regime of truth prior to modernity, can help us to see why virtually every proposed solution to what President Obama has called our epistemological crisis remains merely procedural and technocratic. Even when perceptive scholars recognize that there is a problem of desire at stake, namely that we do not want to know the truth, not a one suggests that we seek to work on the transformation or tutoring of desire. Captive to the modern paradigm, we cannot seem to imagine the possibility that we might have to set about the work of cultivating desire or educating desire. Still less imaginable is a discourse of true desire and false desire. The desire itself might be truth-bearing or distorted. Such ways of talking and thinking cannot be conceived within a paradigm in which truth can be had by proper procedure alone, and truth is a matter of isolated facts. There are no demands made on the desiring subject. According to the experts, what we need is information literacy or social media regulation. Not a word is said about healing or redirecting desire. That, of course, is to leave human subjects in the hands of those who do our desiring for us. We may not ourselves be committed to purifications, ascetic exercises, renunciations, conversions of looking, but the masters of the attention economy are quite sophisticated in capturing and subsequently monetizing desire or mobilizing desire for political ends. When we fail to attend critically to our desiring, others will do our desiring work for us. Ignoring or bypassing desire and rendering it irrelevant to the pursuit of truth in no way overcomes distorted desire. On the contrary, we instead surrender our desiring to those who have now acquired the most sophisticated knowledge of the mechanisms of addiction in order to mobilize desire to a whole assortment of invidious ends. As we conclude this lecture, let us recognize that Foucault's discourse about the way in which the modern moment bypasses and renders attention to the work of desire irrelevant to knowing brings us right back around to how we began this lecture, namely with Jesus and Isaiah. You will indeed listen, but never understand. And you will indeed look, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull. It's not, they haven't read Immanuel Kant. That's not the diagnosis, right? For this people's heart has grown dull. It would appear that our Lord and the prophet Isaiah concur with Foucault. Might it be that Jesus beats Foucault to the punch? That's the sort of thing our Lord does. Jesus holds that the post-truth problem, again, please permit me the anachronism, if indeed an anachronism it is not one of cognition, narrowly construed, but instead the heart. This people's heart has grown dull. That understanding might be a work of the heart is something that Jesus takes for granted. And if that is so, there can be no understanding without a transformation of the heart and its desires. These would have been obvious truth for him. I don't think they are obvious to us anymore. I cannot say what Foucault would have made of this considerable preoccupation with spirituality that has since, in these recent decades after his passing, come to be a prominent feature of North American life in both Canada and the U.S. Does this turn to spirituality herald the beginnings of a recognition that truth cannot be had without price, the price of a transformed subject? There seems to be a real quest for transformation in the air. Are we beginning to recognize the Cartesian moment as a dead end? Are we beginning to recognize that truth cannot be had simply by shallow forms of knowing that require no healing of desire? And then, what shall we offer by way of prognosis and therapy? Are there reasons for hope that once we have correctly identified that the post-truth problem might well be a problem not of misinformation and disinformation, narrowly construed, but is instead a problem of desire, might that mean we might be robustly optimistic about a prognosis for the post-truth condition? What can our religious traditions teach us about not just the prognosis, but a therapy for the post-truth condition? To these questions we will turn over the course of our next two lectures. Thank you.
You know you have heard an outstanding lecture when the first thing you want to do is go listen to it again and look at the quotes, hear the quotes, and really dive into the richness of what John's given us. You also know you've heard an amazing lecture win the front pages of the New York Times and the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Every single article, what John is speaking to us can be applied to what he's sharing. Just one side note, John, the true story, my wife, as many of you know, is a primary care physician, and pretty much for the last 4 years, every night at dinner, she comes home and, I'm quoting, she says, "I have to hit them between the eyes to get them to get their COVID vaccine," some of them. It's not working. I need something else. So what she needs is your lecture now. So thank you. We really are so glad you're here and looking forward to the final two. We really appreciate all you're sharing with us. Our final hymn is number 850, "In Deep Unbounded Darkness." Please stand. Go in peace.
Thank you.
Really,
That was okay?
absolutely. No, really interesting.